At 52, 4 months after she signed the divorce papers on a kitchen table that still had his coffee ring on it, Shelby Crane sat in the cab of a borrowed truck outside a storage unit in Harlan County, Kentucky, with $340 in her checking account and a padlock key her sister had mailed her in a plain white envelope with no note inside. The key had belonged to Shelby's mother. Her mother had been dead for 11 days. Shelby had driven 6 hours from Lexington to get here, and she had not told anyone she was coming, because there was no one left who needed to know where she went. That was the thing about the end of a marriage, and the end of a mother in the same calendar year. It left a person very quiet in a way that didn't feel like peace. She had not known the storage unit existed until the lawyer called about settling the estate, and the estate was not much to settle. A double wide on a half-acre outside of Loyal, a 2009 Chevy Malibu, with the rear passenger window held up by a piece of cardboard and electrical tape, and one storage unit, number 14, at a facility on Cumberland Road, paid up through the end of the year. Her mother, Clarice Hewitt, had kept the unit for going on 9 years and never mentioned it once. Shelby had asked her older brother Dale about it. Dale had shrugged the way Dale shrugged at everything that required more than 3 seconds of consideration and said, "Probably just boxes." You know how she was about boxes. Shelby did know how her mother was about boxes. Clarice Hewitt had saved everything. Grocery receipts, birthday cards from people she'd long outlived, twist ties in a jam jar on the windowsill. But a storage unit 9 years, paid on time, with a padlock key mailed to Shelby specifically and not to Dale. That was not boxes. That was something else. If stories like this one find you at the right moment, take a second and subscribe to Giant Stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these get. Now let me tell you about Shelby. Shelby Crane had spent 23 years married to a man named Kevin who was not a bad man in any of the ways that make for a clean story. He had never raised a hand to her. He had never been dishonest about the money, or not exactly. What he had been was slowly, steadily, thoroughly absent in the way of a man who decides somewhere in his 30s that he has already become everything he is going to become, and sees no reason to keep reaching. He watched television. He went to work. He came home and ate whatever she put in front of him, and said it was fine, and the word fine had calcified over 23 years into the single most exhausting word in the English language. As far as Shelby was concerned, she had tried. She wanted it on the record, even if the only record was her own memory that she had tried. She had suggested counseling 4 separate times across 4 separate years, and each time Kevin had looked at her the way you look at someone who has just proposed something mildly absurd, like taking up fencing or moving to Portugal. "We're fine," he would say. And there was that word again. Her daughter Bryn had grown up and moved to Nashville and called on Sundays, and her son Marcus had grown up and moved to Columbus, and called less than that. And Shelby had found herself at 51 sitting across a kitchen table from a man she had loved once. Genuinely, in the particular way of young people who do not yet know how much can erode, and she could not locate that feeling anywhere in the room. She filed in February. Kevin had not fought it. That was the thing she had not expected, the not fighting. She had steeled herself for anger, for negotiation, for some last evidence that the marriage had mattered enough to be worth contesting. Instead, he had signed where the lawyer told him to sign, and moved into his brother's spare room in Barberville, and that had been that. Her mother had died in September, a stroke fast, the way the doctor said happened sometimes, no suffering they could measure. She was 79 years old and had lived her whole life inside a 40-mile radius of Harlan County, and had, as far as Shelby had known, no secrets worth keeping. That was before the key. Shelby sat in the borrowed truck for a while before she got out. The storage facility was the kind of place that had seen better decades. Chain-link fencing, orange roll-up doors, a manager's office with a light on in the window, and a hand-lettered sign that said "Ring bell for service." The mountains were visible above the roofline, going gold in the afternoon light. She had grown up looking at those mountains and had spent 20 years trying to get far enough away from them that she stopped feeling small. She got out of the truck. She found Unit 14. She fit the key into the padlock. The door rolled up with a sound like a slow exhale. It was not boxes. There were boxes, yes, along the back wall, shoeboxes mostly, stacked and labeled in her mother's small, careful print. But that was not what stopped Shelby in the doorway. What stopped her was the quilting frame. It was a full-size standing frame, the old-fashioned kind, 8 feet across, assembled and set up in the center of the unit as if someone had been working in here just yesterday. Stretched across it was a quilt top, pieced and pinned, a pattern Shelby didn't recognize in blues and creams and one particular deep rust color her mother had always loved. Around the frame on a folding table were baskets, dozens of them, thread and needles and a good pair of scissors in a leather case, and fabric folded in pieces, sorted by color, more fabric than Shelby had seen outside of a shop, and on a second folding table against the wall, a sewing machine, a real one. Not the one her mother kept at the double wide, a different one entirely. Nicer. A brand Shelby didn't recognize, with a box of feet and attachments beside it, and a legal pad propped against the wall with measurements and notes in her mother's handwriting. On a shelf above the sewing machine, lined up like books, were binders. 12 of them at least, each with a date range written on the spine in black marker. Shelby stood in the doorway of that storage unit and looked at a room that should not have existed, because her mother had told her for 40 years that she didn't sew. That was the thing, not that Clarice Hewitt had a hobby. Plenty of women Clarice's age quilted, nobody would have batted an eye. The thing was that she had specifically and repeatedly said she did not. Shelby had quilts in her own house, a grandmother's flower garden from Kevin's aunt, a double wedding ring from a church bazaar she'd bought years ago, and she had commented on them in front of her mother more than once, said she'd always wanted to learn. Asked once if Clarice had ever tried it, and her mother had said, without any particular emphasis, "Oh, I never had the patience for that kind of thing." For 9 years, she had been driving out to a storage unit on Cumberland Road, on some unknown schedule and doing the things she'd said she had no patience for. Shelby pulled the door down behind her, not fully, just enough to cut the wind, and she walked to the quilting frame and looked at the work stretched across it. The stitches where it had been hand-quilted were even and small, the kind that took years to make that consistent. The rust-colored fabric in the pattern was a particular shade she recognized from somewhere she couldn't place, and then she placed it, a dress. A dress her mother had worn in the 1980s that Shelby hadn't thought about in 30 years. She went to the shoeboxes. They were labeled. Names mostly, written in her mother's hand. She pulled the one marked Loretta Sykes. Inside was a quilt, folded small. Small enough for a child's bed. The pattern was simple, a 9-patch, in colors that were pink and green and cheerful in a deliberate way. Tucked into the folds was a card, handwritten, "For the new baby. I hope she grows up warm. Clarice." Shelby set that box down and opened another. Amos Begley. Inside a heavier quilt in browns and greens and outdoorsy palette. A card. "Amos, I know you lost the house. It's a hard winter. Don't tell anyone where this came from. See." She opened a third, then a fourth. Each box held a folded quilt and a handwritten note. Some of the names she recognized, some she didn't. All of the notes had the same quality of her mother's voice, the particular directness of a woman who did not waste words on sentiment she wasn't prepared to back up. Shelby counted the shoeboxes. There were 46 of them. If you've stayed with us this long, please take a second to subscribe, because what Shelby found next in those binders is the part that changes everything you've just been told about her mother. Stay right here. She drove back to the double wide that evening, and she did not sleep much. Before dawn, she made coffee in her mother's kitchen, with her mother's percolator and her mother's particular brand of grounds. And she sat at her mother's table and thought about a woman she had known her entire life, and apparently not known at all. Clarice Hewitt had raised 2 children on a teacher's aide salary, after Shelby's father left in 1981, and did not come back. She had been careful with money in the specific and practiced way of someone for whom carelessness was not an option. She had kept the heat low in winter, and the lights off in rooms nobody was using, and she had driven that Malibu until it was more memory than machine. She had never, in Shelby's recollection, bought herself anything that wasn't necessary. 46 quilts, 9 years. A sewing machine nicer than anything else she owned. Fabric bought and sorted by color. Binders full of notes in her own hand. Where had the money come from? How had she never said a word? In the morning, Shelby went to the one place in Loyal she figured might know something. Not because it was logical, but because it was the place her mother had gone every Friday afternoon for as long as Shelby could remember. The beauty shop on Main, the one called Patsy's, which had been called Patsy's since before Shelby was born and would probably be called Patsy's after everyone who remembered the original Patsy was gone. The woman behind the first chair was named Gwen. She was somewhere in her late 60s, with reading glasses pushed up into copper-dyed hair and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades listening to other people talk. She looked up when Shelby walked in, and her face went soft in the way faces do when they already know. "I figured one of you kids would come in," Gwen said. "I'm real sorry about your mama, thank you," Shelby said. "Gwen, can I ask you something and have you answer me straight?" "You can try," Gwen said, which was honest. Shelby described the storage unit, the frame, the binders, the 46 shoeboxes. She watched Gwen's face while she talked. Gwen did not look surprised, which told Shelby what she'd already half known. "How long did you know?" Shelby asked. Gwen set down her comb. "Since about the 3rd year, when she asked if I someone who could use a quilt." She pulled a stool around and sat down. "Let me tell you something about your mother that she would not have told you herself, because she would have considered it bragging, and Clarice Hewitt did not brag." She told Shelby this in the year after Shelby's father left. That long, stripped-down year when Clarice was 31 years old and had 2 children and no income that wasn't her own. A woman from their church named Helen Sizemore had appeared at the door one December morning with a box. Inside the box was a quilt, homemade, in colors that were warm. No note. Helen had denied it was from her for 6 months before she finally admitted it, and by then Clarice had worn the thing to a softness. It was the only time in her adult life Clarice had told Gwen once that someone had given her something she needed before she had to ask for it. "The dignity of that," she said. "The dignity of not having to ask." She had spent the next 40 years waiting to do the same thing for somebody else. She'd see it in people, Gwen said. A woman at the grocery with 2 thin kids and a careful face. A man at the gas station putting back a 6-pack because he'd counted wrong. She had a way of noticing. She'd go home and she'd make something. Gwen shook her head. "She never asked me to keep it quiet, but she never told me to spread it around either. I figured it wasn't mine to tell." "Where did she get the money for the fabric?" Shelby asked. Her voice had gone careful, the way voices go when the answer might cost something. Gwen looked at her steadily. "You know how your mama ate lunch?" Shelby thought. She always brought something from home, every day for 20 years. Never bought so much as a cup of coffee in the teacher's lounge if she could help it. $5 a week, she told me once. That's what she figured she saved. $5 a week for 20 years. Gwen let that sit there in the air between them. She called it the quilt fund. Never wrote that down anywhere, I don't think. Just knew $5 a week, $260 a year. Over 20 years, Shelby did the math standing there in a beauty shop that smelled like developer and hairspray. $5,200. Fabric and thread and batting, and the good scissors and the nicer sewing machine purchased over a decade. Slowly, one payday at a time, by a woman who had told her own daughter she didn't have the patience for quilting. She had not lacked patience. She had lacked anyone to receive it. Shelby drove back out to the storage unit that afternoon, and she went to the binders on the shelf above the sewing machine. The first one was dated 2015, which was as far back as they went. She opened it. It was a record. Not a diary, not really. Her mother had not been a diary person. It was more like a logbook. Each entry was a name, a date, a short description, 3 or 4 lines, sometimes less, written in Clarice's small, deliberate hand. October 2015. Donna Yancey on Path Fork Road, laid off from the Dollar General when they cut hours, has 3 kids, youngest in 2nd grade. Made her the double 4-patch in red and navy, left it on the porch. December 2015, Toby Maines. I don't know him well, but I know his truck broke down and he's been walking to the BP 3 miles to get to his second job. Made him the log cabin in gray and green. Gwen knew his sister and got me the address. February 2016, Rose Ellen Combs. She's 91 and in the assisted living on the highway, and her daughter moved to Oregon and never visits. I know because Gwen does her hair every 6 weeks, and she always asks Gwen to stay a little longer. Made her the double wedding ring in lavender. Told the nurse it was from a friend. Didn't say which one. Page after page after page. 46 entries across 9 years. Some of the names Shelby recognized from somewhere in the long geography of growing up in a small county. Most she did not. Each one had the same quality of her mother's attention. Specific, unflashy, seeing the thing exactly as it was without making it larger or smaller than it needed to be. She sat on a folding chair next to the quilting frame, and she read her mother for the first time. Clarice Hewitt had never once, in Shelby's memory, described herself as generous. She had never used the word charity without a kind of tightness in her voice. The tightness of someone who had been on the receiving end of charity that did not feel like generosity. She had told Shelby once, when Shelby was maybe 12 years old, that the worst thing you could do for a person in a hard time was make them feel small about it. Shelby had not known, until now, that her mother had spent 4 decades building an entire practice around that belief. There was one entry near the back of the last binder that stopped Shelby cold. September 2024. I am not going to be able to keep this up much longer, and I know it. My hands are giving me trouble this year, and the doctor says it's the arthritis getting into the fingers, and there's only so much you can do. The quilt on the frame right now is going to be the last one I can finish this size, I think. It's for a family I heard about from Gwen. Young couple lost their place in the flooding down by Bledsoe last spring. They're staying with her parents and it's crowded. And the baby's coming in November. I want to get it done. I have been thinking about what happens to all this when I go. I don't want Dale getting into it. Not because he's not a good man, but because he won't understand it and he'll give it to Goodwill. And that's not wrong, but it's not right, either. Shelby will understand. She's had a hard year, from what I can tell. She won't say it, but I can tell. I'm going to mail her the key. She'll know what to do with it. Shelby read that entry twice, then a third time. She had not cried at the funeral. She had done that alone in the parking lot of the church before anyone arrived. And what she'd cried about wasn't grief exactly. It was the particular ache of a woman who had just realized that the thing she'd been most starved for, her whole adult life, was to have someone see her clearly and trust her anyway. She had not known until she read it in her mother's logbook, in a storage unit on Cumberland Road, that the person who had seen her clearest had been Clarice Hewitt all along. She cried now. She sat next to the quilting frame in a folding chair and she cried in the particular way of someone who has been given back, something they didn't know they'd lost. When she was done, she looked at the quilt, stretched across the frame, the one her mother had been working on last. Blues and creams and that deep rust color from the old dress. It was 3/4 done. The hand quilting had been started in the center and worked outward in a pattern Shelby didn't know the name of, radiating out from the middle like something that had been expanding for a long time and wasn't finished yet. She pulled the chair closer. She sat for a while looking at the stitches. Then, very carefully, she picked up the needle her mother had left threaded in the fabric. She had never quilted in her life. She had no idea what she was doing. She made 2 stitches, close together, uneven, nothing like her mother's, and then she stopped and just held the needle and looked at the mountain visible through the gap in the unit door and thought about a woman who had learned to do a hard, patient thing in secret for 40 years, for the benefit of people who had never once seen her do it. She was 52 years old and she had not figured out what she was for yet. That was the honest truth of where she was sitting. But she had a storage unit on Cumberland Road and 9 years of binders and 46 shoeboxes worth of proof that her mother had once been exactly where she was and had found a way to answer the question. She set the needle down. She was not ready to finish the quilt, not today. But she was not going to leave it either. First, she needed to understand what she had inherited. And to do that, she needed to talk to the people in those binders. The woman who came to the door on Pathfork Road looked at Shelby the way you look at someone you weren't expecting, part guarded, part waiting to be asked for something. She was in her early 40s, Donna Yancey with a child's shoe by the front door, and another visible through the living room. Shelby introduced herself, said she was Clarice Hewitt's daughter. Watched the woman's face change. "Oh," Donna said, and then she said it again differently. "Oh." She let Shelby in. They sat at the kitchen table over coffee that was too strong and too good, the way coffee gets when people make it right instead of fast. The navy and red quilt was on the back of the couch in the living room. It had been washed enough times that the binding had softened, which meant it had been used, which meant it had been kept. "I didn't know her," Donna said. "I mean, I knew who she was, the way you know people. But she wasn't somebody I'd have called a friend. I came home one day and that was on the porch, folded up, and I just stood there." She shook her head. "I went to the grocery a few days later and I saw her and I tried to thank her, and she acted like she didn't know what I was talking about. Just said, 'Oh, someone must have been thinking about you,' and walked off." Donna smiled at the table. "I figured out it was her eventually. I just never knew how to bring it up after that." Shelby went back to the storage unit that evening and she looked at the names in the binders with different eyes. Not a record, a map. In the days that followed, she went to find them. Not all 46. Some had moved, some were hard to locate. One, Rose Ellen Combs, had passed the previous spring at 94, but she found enough. An older man named Curtis Birchfield who'd gotten a quilt during a hospitalization nobody had known about. He'd been in the hospital for 3 weeks, and his wife had just died that year. And he said the quilt arriving at his house while he was gone, left with a neighbor who didn't know who'd brought it, had been the first time in months he'd felt like the world had noticed him. A young woman named Tasha Deaton, whose quilt had gone with her to a shelter and then to her own place, and then to the apartment she now shared with her kids, always on the bed, always. And Toby Maines, who had walked 3 miles each way to a BP for 6 months, and had come home one evening to find a folded log cabin quilt on his porch, and had sat on that porch until dark trying to figure out who had left it, and never had. He was 38 now. He still had it. He kept it in his truck. "I've thought about it a lot," Toby told Shelby, standing in the driveway of his house, a decent house now, with a truck that ran. Who it was, whoever they were, they saw something I was trying real hard not to show, and they didn't make a thing of it, just left something warm and walked off. He looked at her steadily. "That meant more than you can probably understand, ma'am, to a man who was right at the bottom of things and needed to believe somebody noticed." Shelby understood. She thought she might understand better than most right now, and she told him so. There was something else she needed to deal with. She had come back to the storage unit on the 3rd day to find Dale's truck parked outside. Dale was leaning against the roll-up door, with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had decided what something was before he looked at it. "I talked to the lawyer," Dale said. "Unit's part of the estate. Needs to be cleared out by end of the month or we keep paying on it." "I'll pay for it," Shelby said. "You don't have money to pay for storage, Shelby. Kevin told me what the settlement was." He said it not unkindly, which was almost worse. "Dale." Shelby rolled up the door. She let him look. He looked for a long time. His jaw moved in the particular way their mother's jaw had moved when she was doing math in her head, a family tic neither of them had ever commented on. "What is all this?" he said. Shelby told him. All of it, the shoeboxes, the binders, the 46 names, Gwen at the beauty shop, the $5 a week for 20 years. She watched Dale's face go through something she didn't have a name for. He was not a man who showed things easily, Dale. He had that from their mother, too. "She never said anything," he said. "Not once. In 40 years. No." Dale stood there for a while. He picked up the shoebox marked Amos Begley and looked at the note inside. Set it down carefully. "We need to keep the storage," he said. "I know. I'll split it with you." He said it fast. The way he said things he'd decided on and didn't want to examine too closely. "The bill. I'll split it." Shelby looked at him. In 20 years of adulthood, she and Dale had not been close in the way of siblings who choose each other. They had been close in the way of people who shared something too big and early to talk about comfortably. A father who left, a mother who stayed and made something out of staying. She had not known, until right now, that Dale had spent 40 years watching Clarice Hewitt and arriving at the same conclusion she had. Their mother had been extraordinary. In the most ordinary, invisible, specific, daily way. Extraordinary. The quilt on the frame was for the young couple whose place had flooded. Their baby had been born in November. It was February now. Shelby drove out to the storage unit every day for 2 weeks, and she watched YouTube videos at night on her phone. And she bought a how-to book at the library sale for 50 cents. And she learned, badly and slowly and with a frustration she recognized, as her mother's stubbornness coming out sideways in her own hands, how to quilt. The stitches she put in were nothing like Clarice's. They were twice as big and half as even. But she got better. Not fast, not gracefully, but she got better in the specific way you get better at things, when the alternative is quitting, and quitting is not what the person you're trying to honor would have done. She finished the quilt in March. She drove it out to the couple on a Friday afternoon, not because she knew them, because she didn't, but because the dress was in the binder and her mother had started it for them, and leaving it undone was not something she could live with. She put it on the porch of the house where they were staying with her parents, rang the bell, and walked back to the truck before anyone came to the door. She sat in the truck at the end of the road and watched a young woman come out and pick up the folded quilt and stand there with it against her chest and look around at the empty driveway, and Shelby thought, there it is. She is what her mother had driven out to that storage unit for. Not the making exactly, though the making mattered. It was this exact feeling, which had no adequate name, of having done something for a person who didn't know you'd done it, and watching them receive it, and knowing the world was very slightly less cold than it had been before. She sat in the truck for a long time. She was 52 years old and 4 months out of a marriage and $340 in a checking account. And she had just driven a quilt across Harlan County for a family she had never met. She felt more like herself than she had in years. In April, she went back to the beauty shop. She sat in Gwen's chair, and she asked Gwen if she knew anyone who could use a quilt right now, and Gwen took off her reading glasses and looked at Shelby in the mirror for a moment, and then she said, "I know 3 families." Shelby opened a new binder when she got home. She wrote the date on the spine. She wrote the first name on the first page. Then she went to the storage unit, and she sat down at the sewing machine, her mother's good one, the one she'd bought one payday at a time, and she started cutting fabric from the sorted stacks. And she thought about a woman who had shown up at a 31-year-old's door one December morning with a box, and changed the direction of everything that followed without ever knowing she had. Dale called that evening. He asked how it was going. She said fine. Then she said, "Actually, it's not fine, it's the opposite of fine. It's the best I've felt in a year." There was a pause, and Dale said, "Yeah, just that. Yeah." The way a man says it when he means something much longer that he doesn't know how to get to yet. She kept the unit, she learned. She got better at the stitches. By summer, the binder had 7 names in it. Her own hand, not her mother's. Her own entries, written in the same small, careful print she hadn't known she'd inherited. The woman at the laundromat with the 2 coats for 3 kids. The veteran at the VFW post who'd mentioned offhand that his apartment was drafty, and he hated to run up the heat bill. The little girl in Bryn's old 3rd grade class whose teacher had posted something vague on Facebook about a hard family situation. Enough for Shelby to find the address and nothing more. She didn't tell anyone where the quilts came from. She told Gwen, because Gwen already knew, and because Gwen was useful the way her mother had always known Gwen to be useful. She knew everything about everyone within 40 miles, and she shared it with the right people at the right time, with a discretion that was rare and worth respecting. The county eventually heard about the quilts. Not because Shelby said anything, but because Harlan County is not large and things get out. A piece ran in the local paper, short, kind, inaccurate in the ways local journalism is inaccurate about things it can't fully verify. Shelby did not give them her name. She said, when a reporter called the house, that the quilts were from her mother, and she was just continuing something that had been started. The piece ran with the headline, "Anonymous Quilter Carries on Local Tradition," which was close enough. The unfinished quilt from the frame, the blues and creams and rust, the one her mother had been working on last. Shelby had set aside. She hadn't known at first what to do with it. The young couple already had theirs. This one had been started without a destination, or if it had one, Clarice had not written it down, and the last binder entry hadn't named a recipient. She understood eventually that it had been made for her. Not consciously, maybe. But her mother had been using that particular rust color, the one from a dress Shelby had seen 100 times as a child, the one from a decade she'd never talked about. And the pattern was the radiating one, the one that kept expanding outward from the center. No one makes something like that for a stranger. She brought it home. She put it on her bed, where it fit the way things fit when they were made for a space someone knew well from the inside. She was not the same woman who had sat outside that storage unit in February with a padlock key and no idea what she was walking into. She had a better idea now of who her mother had been, which meant she had a better idea of who she could still become, which at 52 felt like a gift she hadn't known to ask for, but would spend the rest of her life trying to deserve. In the front of the new binder, she had written a line at the top of the first page. Not a rule, exactly. More like what her mother would have called a fact. The dignity is in not making them ask. She was going to keep that. She was going to keep all of it. The mountains were still there when she drove back from the storage unit in the evenings, going gold or going gray depending on the time of day, and she had spent 20 years trying to outrun them, and she was not sure anymore what she had been in such a hurry to get away from. She knew this county. She knew these roads. She knew the specific quality of a December morning in Harlan County. The cold that comes off the ridge before the sun has cleared it, the smell of wood smoke from houses where people are keeping the heat low and making do. She knew how to notice someone who needed something before they had to ask. It was not nothing. It was not, it turned out, a small thing to know. Her mother had known it her whole life and had treated it like a private matter, a thing you did quietly and without credit, the way you paid your own bills and changed your own oil and did not mention it. Shelby was going to do it the same way. She had the binder. She had the storage unit. She had the sewing machine and the stacks of fabric sorted by color and the good scissors in the leather case. And she had 46 examples of what it looked like when you paid attention to the world, instead of just passing through it. She had her mother's hands, she found out. In the literal sense, the stitches, once she got them small enough, looked like Clarice's. She hadn't known that until she was far enough along to see it, and when she did see it, she sat very still for a moment and then she kept going, because that was what you did with something you were given. You kept going. You kept it open.